After World War I, Germany was forced to accept responsibility for the damages caused in the war and was obliged to pay reparations to the Allies. Since the war in the Western Front was fought predominantly on French soil, most of the reparations were owed to France. Germany had to pay 226 billion gold marks, which is equivalent to about $888 today. And in 1921, the amount was reduced to 132 billion marks. And since part of the reparations were in raw materials, some German factories ran short once the German economy suffered, and the damage was further done when the country had to pay even more. At this time, France increasingly looked towards German reparations payments as a way to stabilize their own economy. In late 1922, the Allies believed that the German government had defaulted on the timber deliveries as a way of testing the willpower of the Allies to enforce the treaty. Raymond Poincaré, the French Prime Minister, hoped for a joint Anglo-French economic sanctions against Germany, and by December of 1922, however, the French saw coal and steel production as payments laid out in the Treaty of Versailles draining away, and they turned towards military action to get their worth out of Germany. Between January 11th and the 16th, 1923, French and Belgian troops under the command of General Jean Dagot, initially numbering 60,000 men and later 100,000, occupied the highly industrialized Ruhr area as a response to Germany repeatedly defaulting on their reparations. The French and Belgians intended to use force to force Germany to supply the coal and other raw materials that were part of their reparations. The French immediately took over civil administration from the Germans. In order to determine the capacity of smelters and mines to fulfill the reparations, the Inter-Allied Mission for Control of Factories and Mines, or MICUM, also moved in with the French and Belgian Expeditionary Corps. The MICUM consisted of 72 French, Belgian, and Italian experts, most of whom were engineers. It is not entirely clear whether Poincaré was concerned with more than just providing reparations, or if he is more so intending just to use force on people. The British government categorized the occupation of the Ruhr as illegal. The US government condemned the occupation as a reprehensible policy of force. Anyways, the occupation was met by a campaign of both passive resistance and civil disobedience from the German inhabitants of the Ruhr. Chancellor Kuno immediately encouraged the passive resistance, and on January 13th, the Reichstag voted 283 to 12 to approve it as a formal policy by the government. Officials were told not to cooperate with the occupying forces, and deliveries of reparation material were all stopped. Protests against the occupation broke out all across Germany. In factories and mines, German strike leaders were arrested and French strike breakers were brought in. Attempts to ship out reserves of coal failed when the German railroad officials and workers walked off the job, and some places removed signs from stations as well as signal boxes. The French once again brought their own people to take control of the railways, although it took months to get everything running properly. Even though relatively little violence accompanied the passive resistance, French authorities imposed between 120,000 and 150,000 sentences against resisting Germans. Some of these involved prison sentences, but an overwhelming majority were deportations to unoccupied parts of Germany. Acts of violence and sabotage also occurred where nationalist and communist groups blew up train tracks, bridges, and canals, and there were also some instances where these groups killed collaborators at the French and Belgian posts. However, the occupation forces also responded with violence against civilians. Acts of violence and accidents caused by the occupation forces had resulted in 137 deaths, 603 injuries, and more by August of 1924, shortly before the passive resistance campaign was called off. Monetary damages to the economy of the Ruhr caused by the occupation were estimated to be between 3.5 and 4 billion gold marks. Germany's new government, which would be elected and led by Gustav Stresemann of the German People's Party, would announce an end to passive resistance on September 26th. 2 months later, the government replaced the paper mark with the Rentemark and restored the value of Germany's currency. In response to ending the passive resistance campaign, the Kernsteinputsch of October 1st, 1923 was launched. This was a coup attempt against the Weimar Republic by units of the paramilitary Black Reichswehr under Bruno Ernst Bucheracker, but would fail and the government dissolved the Black Reichswehr. Chancellor Stresemann sought discussions with the Allied powers, which were to take into consideration what Germany was financially capable of paying rather than what the reparations were supposed to be. The Reparations Commission set up the Doss Committee, headed by American economist Charles Doss. It recommended that total reparations would be reduced from 132 billion to 50 billion marks. Germany also received a loan of 800 million marks, financed primarily by American banks. British Labour Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, who had also viewed the 132 billion as impossible for Germany to pay, would successfully pressure French Premier Edouard Herriot into a series of concessions into Germany. Under heavy Anglo-American financial pressure, the decline in the value of the franc made the French open to pressure from Wall Street and the City of London, so the French agreed to the DOS plan. Following approval by the German Reichstag, the plan went into effect on September 1, 1924. Germany's financial burden would be eased and its international relations would improve. On September 3rd, the Inter-Allied Rhineland High Commission returned control of the administration and economy back to the German people. Amnesty would be decreed, and most signs of the occupation would disappear from public view. The last French troops would evacuate on August 25, 1925. The occupation has caused an international outpouring of sympathy towards Germany and hostility to Belgium, but mostly against the French. The U.S. firmly supported Germany, and interwar tensions between France and Britain peaked during the occupation. France's allies, being Poland and Czechoslovakia, also opposed the occupation because of their commercial links towards Germany, and their concern that the action would push Germany closer into an alliance with the Soviet Union. The French occupation of the Ruhr accelerated the formation of right-wing parties. The ruling center-left coalition was discredited by its inability to address the crisis, while the far-left Communist Party of Germany remained inactive. The occupation would also contribute to the growth of radical right-wing movements in Germany, and Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party would use the occupation as part of their justification during their failed beer hall putsch in November of 1923. And that is a brief overview of the Allied occupation of the Ruhr. Is there anything I left out or should have talked more on? What other aspects of the interwar period should I cover? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.